All right, welcome back from break. So, kind of an overall thing here. I probably should have done this before we start succession, but really what we're doing now is thinking about species diversity. And what we need to do now with species diversity is consider it over multiple scales, both temporal and spatial. Everything that we've done so far has dealt with the species diversity concept at one very simple spatial scale, that is the community. So it made sense to talk about succession in communities because we're talking about a community over a temporal scale, but it's still that one community. So now what we need to do is kind of put species diversity and this multiple species scale together into one kind of a concept. Anytime we talk about scaling, temporal or spatial, things can get kind of ugly. To me, scaling is a very difficult concept to get through. I know we've talked about it. Now what let's do is let's put together these concepts. Now, just as a reminder, we had a few different ways to think about species diversity. One of those was species richness. One of those had to do with abundance measures, which was relative dominance, relative density, relative frequency. And if we take richness and abundance together, that got us to those species diversity measures, things like Shannon's index, Simpson's index. But keep in mind that any of these could be used as an attempt to quantify diversity. It's just that the combination of the two probably makes the most sense to people. However, if we're interested in a particular area, it may be entirely possible for us to go out and quantify these two things. We can get a measure of species richness by doing a rarefaction curve, and we can get a measure of abundance by counting individuals. But as soon as I shift from this very small spatial scale into larger geographic spatial scales, maybe looking at not just the Erie Bluff State Park and its species richness and abundance, but maybe then we move to Erie County, and then the state or commonwealth level, and then the nation level. Well, quantifying richness and abundance together is incredibly time consuming. So as we shift up these spatial scales, we don't have enough time to do all this stuff, let alone the money, etc. So what tends to happen is people shift up to these larger spatial scales, or even larger temporal scales, like fossil record type temporal scales. We're at species richness. Let's not quantify abundance, let's just do richness. We have a shot at getting those measures up to these higher temporal and spatial scales, but quantifying the number of individuals of a particular species of mouse in a park and in the county, state, and country, that's billions of mice, right? So I just want to remind you that these three are all relevant to species diversity. So now what we're going to do as we talk about diversity is basically stick with a richness approach. That is, we're using richness to estimate the diversity. Right, so let's consider a particular location here, Erie Bluff State Park, and we have areas within the park that are fairly well defined.